They warned me about her. Said she was too old, too complicated, too much for someone like me. But the first time her eyes lingered on mine across that fence, I knew, people could talk all they wanted. Their words would never touch what was quietly growing between us. I'd seen her many times before, usually in passing. Sometimes in the early mornings when she stepped out to water the flowers, her robe tied loosely around her waist, hair gathered in a quick knot. Other times in the evening, when the sun leaned low and her garden glowed with that soft golden light, she'd kneel by the roses with her hands deep in the soil, moving with a kind of quiet grace that felt deliberate. We'd exchanged polite words over the months. A wave here. A brief hello there. Always friendly, never more than neighbors should be. But that evening, something shifted. I was leaning against the fence, sipping a glass of water, when I noticed her crouched by the lavender bed. A strand of her hair had slipped free from its clip, brushing against her cheek every time the breeze stirred. She tucked it back absent-mindedly with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint trace of soil along her temple. I should have looked away, given her the privacy of the moment. But my eyes stayed. She must have felt it, because after a while, she glanced up. And this time, instead of the usual polite nod, her gaze held mine. It wasn't long, just a heartbeat, maybe two, but in that span of silence, the air between us changed. The chatter of cicadas, the hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, the faint scent of roses drifting across the fence, all of it seemed to fade, like the world was stepping back to give us space. I smiled first. Not the casual kind, not the neighborly reflex. A real smile. The sort you give when you're caught, when you don't know what else to do but admit, silently, that you were looking. And then she smiled back. Slow. Small. But there was something behind it, something more than politeness. For a moment, I noticed the lines at the corners of her eyes, not as flaws, but as proof that she'd laughed deeply, lived fully. The sunlight caught the curve of her cheek, and in that instant she seemed less like a neighbor and more like a presence. Someone who filled the evening with more warmth than the fading sun. Neither of us spoke. She rose from the ground, brushing her hands against her jeans, the soil leaving little shadows across the denim. She leaned slightly on the fence, close enough that I could hear the soft hitch in her breath, close enough that I caught the faintest trace of her perfume, something floral, layered, grounding. And though nothing was said, I felt it, a question hanging unspoken in the air. That was the first time I realized there was something more than simple friendliness between us. Something neither of us had acknowledged, but both of us had sensed. I set down my glass and nodded, as if to say good night, but my chest carried a weight that hadn't been there before, a weight made of curiosity, of wonder, and of the lingering warmth of her smile. That was the night the garden stopped being just hers. It became the place where everything quietly began. The days that followed carried on as usual, or at least, they appeared to. I went to work, came home, passed by the familiar fence that separated her yard from mine. But something about our last glance lingered with me. Her smile had left a mark, like a fingerprint pressed softly against my chest, and I found myself waiting, listening, for the smallest chance to hear her voice again. It didn't take long. One evening, I stepped outside with a book in hand. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of cut grass, and her porch light was already glowing softly. She was sitting there, barefoot, a mug of something steaming between her palms. She noticed me, lifted her chin in a quiet hello, and before I realized it, I was crossing the short stretch of lawn that led to her steps. We talked about simple things at first. The weather that couldn't decide between rain or sun. The neighbor's dog who barked at everything except strangers. She asked what I was reading, and when I told her, she surprised me by quoting a line from the same author. That caught me off guard. Not just her memory, but the way she recited it, like the words belonged to her, worn smooth from use. I laughed, shaking my head. I didn't expect you to know that one. She gave me that look again, the one that seemed to weigh her response before giving it. I know more than people think, she said softly, a hint of humor curling in her voice, though her eyes carried something deeper. And just like that, our conversation stretched into something unplanned. We spoke about books, about the comfort of late-night coffee, about how the quiet of evening often said more than the noise of the day. Each topic was light, ordinary, yet the pauses between them weren't empty. They brimmed with something else, something unsaid. Every time she tilted her head to listen, the porch light caught in her hair, turning the strands into threads of gold. And when she laughed, really laughed, her shoulders relaxed in a way that made me realize how tense they'd been before. There was a rhythm to it. I'd speak, she'd listen, her gaze holding steady for a second longer than politeness required. Then she'd respond, her voice soft, deliberate, carrying both confidence and a shadow of something unspoken. It was in those shadows, in those quiet pauses, that I began to sense her more clearly, not just as a neighbor, but as a woman who carried 1,000 stories inside her, choosing carefully which ones to share. I remember the way the steam from her mug curled upward, carrying with it the faint scent of chamomile. The night air was cool, yet every time her hand brushed against mine on the porch rail, a warmth spread through me, steady and undeniable. We didn't sit close enough to touch often, but the space between us felt fragile, like a single movement could change everything. And though neither of us named it, we both knew. When the evening ended, I walked back to my side of the fence with the sound of her laugh still echoing in my ears. I thought about the way she'd looked at me, like she wanted to say more, but chose to let silence speak instead. And in that silence, I felt it growing, something neither of us could yet define, but neither of us wanted to let go of. It's strange how quickly people notice things. You think no one's paying attention, that your life moves quietly in its own little rhythm. But the truth is, eyes wander, ears catch whispers, and soon enough, stories are being told that you never intended to write. It started small. A comment at the cafe where I sometimes stopped for breakfast. An older man I knew in passing raised an eyebrow and smirked, "You've been spending a lot of evenings on that porch lately." His tone was light, almost teasing, but I felt the weight behind it. I laughed it off, but as I walked home, his words clung to me. I thought about how it must look, me, younger, sitting with her night after night, voices low, smiles shared. And maybe, just maybe, I wondered if she'd heard the same whispers. A few days later, I found out she had. We were standing near the fence, twilight stretching across the sky, when I mentioned it lightly. Tried to make a joke out of it. "You know," I said, brushing my hand along the wooden rail, "people are starting to talk." She stilled. For a second, she didn't respond. Then, with that familiar composure of hers, she folded her arms across her chest and leaned back against the fence. "Of course they are," she said softly, her mouth curling into a wry smile. "People always do." But even as she smiled, her eyes flicked away, just for a moment, and I caught something there, a shadow, a flicker of old wounds. I wanted to ask what it meant, what history lingered behind those words. But I didn't. I only stood there, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingertips, and let the silence stretch between us. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. Then she looked back at me, her gaze steady again. "It's easier to let them talk," she added, "than to waste your life trying to silence them." I nodded, though inside, I wrestled with it. Because it wasn't just about them, it was about us. About what those whispers might reveal, or distort, before we even had the chance to understand what this was becoming. The night air carried the faint smell of rain, the sky bruised with heavy clouds. She shifted closer, her sleeve brushing lightly against my arm. It wasn't intentional, at least, it didn't look that way, but the contact sent a warmth running through me. I realized then that I didn't care much about the voices outside our fence. What mattered was the quiet between us, the way her presence grounded me more than anyone's approval ever could. When I finally spoke, my voice was softer than I intended. "Let them," I said. "If they want to talk, let them." Her lips parted, as if she might respond, but instead she just held my gaze. For a heartbeat, her eyes softened, the corners trembling with something almost vulnerable. Then she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. And in that moment, I understood, the whispers weren't the real obstacle. The real question was whether we were brave enough to step into the story they were already telling. It was late afternoon when I noticed her in the driveway, a cardboard box balanced awkwardly against her hip. She was trying to manage the weight of it while nudging her door open with her shoulder. The sight of her, graceful in so many moments, now stumbling under something too heavy, pulled me across the lawn before I even thought twice. "Here, let me," I called out, reaching her just as the box tilted. She hesitated, as if caught between pride and relief, then exhaled and let me take it. "Thank you," she murmured, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I didn't realize how heavy it was until I picked it up. The box wasn't just heavy, it was awkward, stuffed with old books, judging by the faint smell of paper and dust that drifted from its seams. I carried it inside, stepping across her threshold for the first time. Her house felt warm, lived in. The air carried the faint sweetness of vanilla, layered with something richer, coffee, maybe, or the memory of it. The walls were lined with shelves, books stacked not just neatly but in small, personal clusters, as though she arranged them by feeling rather than order. "Just there," she said, pointing toward the kitchen table. I set the box down, the wood beneath it creaking softly. She laughed lightly, embarrassed. "I keep telling myself I'll donate half of these, but somehow they keep multiplying." I smiled, catching the way her hand lingered on the edge of the table, fingers tapping nervously. She was composed, yes, but there was a fragility beneath it, a small hesitation, like she wasn't used to people standing here, in her space. She poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, sliding one toward me as we sat. The steam curled upward, carrying that familiar, grounding scent. "You know," she said after a pause, "I don't usually invite people in." Her tone was casual, but her eyes flicked to mine, searching. "Not because I don't want to. Just, because it's easier to keep some things private." I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. "I understand," I said quietly. And I meant it. For a moment, silence wrapped around us, not uncomfortable, but full, like a blanket pulled snug. She took a sip, then set her mug down, and as she did, her fingers brushed against mine where they rested on the table. The contact was brief, almost accidental. But it was enough. A jolt ran through me, subtle yet undeniable, the kind that makes your breath falter for just a second. Her eyes lifted, catching mine, and for the first time I saw something unguarded there. Not just confidence, not just composure, but a softness, a question she hadn't yet spoken aloud. We didn't name it. We didn't have to. The weight of the moment was its own kind of language. When I finally stood to leave, the scent of vanilla and coffee followed me out, clinging like a memory I wasn't ready to let go of. And as I stepped back across the fence to my side of the yard, I realized the line between neighbor and something more had already begun to blur. It was one of those nights when the air felt too heavy to stay indoors. The sky was clear, the kind of deep indigo that makes you believe every star is burning just for you. I wandered out into the yard, and there she was, already outside, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the jasmine vines that climbed her fence. She looked up when she heard me, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and welcome. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice low, as though the night itself demanded softness. I shook my head and crossed the space between us. She made room without a word, and I sat down, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her but not close enough to touch. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, sweet and sharp, blending with the faint trace of her perfume. For a while, we just sat there, our silence filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I could feel the tension in her posture, the way her hands rested still in her lap, fingers folded tightly together. She was holding something back. Finally, she exhaled, a sound that seemed to carry more than just air. "Do you ever feel like the world is always watching?" she asked, her eyes still on the stars. "Like no matter what you do, someone is waiting to judge it? I hesitated before answering. Sometimes. But I think, maybe it says more about them than about us. She turned then, looking at me in a way that made the night feel even quieter. It's not so simple when you're me, she whispered. I've made choices people didn't understand. I've lived in ways they thought were wrong. And once they decide who you are, it's hard to convince them otherwise. Her voice carried both defiance and weariness, like someone who had fought the same battle too many times. I wanted to tell her I didn't care, that her story wasn't theirs to write. But I stayed quiet, letting her words settle, letting her know I was listening. After a moment, she smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with something more fragile. I don't usually talk about this, she said. But with you, it feels easier. Her confession hung between us, delicate as glass. I shifted slightly, and our knees brushed. The contact was small, accidental perhaps, but neither of us moved away. Instead, I felt her lean just a little, as though allowing the space to shrink between us. The stars above stretched endless, and yet it felt like the universe had narrowed to this single bench, to the warmth of her shoulder against mine. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the ache of wanting to reach for her hand and not quite daring to. We sat that way for a long time, saying little. Her story had been spoken, her guard lowered, and in the silence that followed, I realized something: this wasn't just companionship anymore. This was trust. This was the beginning of something neither of us could deny. When she finally tilted her head to rest lightly against my shoulder, the world outside our little corner ceased to matter. It was just her, just me, and the quiet promise of what might come next. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. A look here, a smirk there, the kind of knowing glances people exchange when they think they've uncovered someone else's secret. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was above it. But when I saw the way those words sometimes lingered on her, I knew it wasn't so easy. One evening, I found her on the porch, sitting alone with a glass of wine. The setting sun painted her skin in gold and shadow, her profile lit softly against the fading sky. She looked tired. Not physically, but in the way her eyes held a quiet heaviness, as though she was carrying too many things that couldn't be put down. I leaned against the railing beside her. "Rough day?" I asked. She gave me a half-smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing new. People have opinions. They always have." She took a slow sip, then set the glass down carefully, her fingers lingering around the stem. "But lately, it feels like they're watching more closely." I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, but that would have been a lie. I'd seen it too, the raised brows, the hushed tones. So instead, I said quietly, "They're already talking." Her eyes flicked to mine, a flash of both challenge and fear passing through them. "And what do you say when they ask?" she murmured. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned toward her, close enough now to see the faint reflection of the porch light in her eyes. I let the silence carry the weight of my choice, then said softly, firmly, "Then let them imagine the rest." Her lips parted slightly, as though she'd been holding her breath. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me, searching. And then something shifted. A small tremor of laughter broke from her, not mocking, but almost relieved. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered, shaking her head. But her voice had softened, the edge of weariness giving way to something warmer. I reached for her hand, not boldly, not suddenly, but slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her palm met mine, warm and steady, and when her thumb brushed across my skin in the smallest of movements, it felt like a promise. For the first time, we didn't pretend the closeness was accidental. We sat there with our fingers intertwined, the world outside our porch humming with its own noise, and none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the way her shoulders eased, the way her breath grew steadier, the way her hand held onto mine as though she'd been waiting for this, waiting for me, to quiet the storm. The whispers hadn't gone anywhere. They wouldn't. But sitting there, her head turning just slightly toward me, her lips curving into a smile that belonged to no one else, I realized we'd already given people what they wanted, a story. The rest of it, the truth, the tenderness, the things they would never see, that was ours alone. The days that followed were quieter, not because the world had stopped whispering, but because we had. We no longer flinched at the sound of it, no longer adjusted the space between us to make it appear less than what it was. Something in us had shifted the night she took my hand and didn't let go. From then on, it became natural. I'd wander into her garden on lazy evenings, helping her trim the roses or carry bags of soil. She'd lean on the fence with a glass of iced tea waiting for me when I came home from work, her eyes crinkling at the corners when she smiled. Sometimes we'd sit on her porch until midnight, sharing stories about books, about mistakes, about the kind of dreams you don't admit to just anyone. The difference wasn't in what we did, it was in how we did it. No longer cautious, no longer worried who might see. One Saturday, I joined her at the market. I carried the basket while she chose tomatoes and herbs, her arm brushing mine as we walked through the stalls. I felt the looks, the quiet questions flickering across strangers' faces. But instead of shrinking from them, she reached out and slipped her hand through the crook of my arm. The simple weight of it silenced everything else. Later, as we strolled down the quiet street back toward our houses, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops, I noticed how naturally she leaned into me. Her head tilted just enough that I could smell the faint trace of jasmine in her hair, her steps falling easily in rhythm with mine. "You know they'll never stop talking," she said softly, not as a worry this time, but as a fact. "Then let them," I replied, smiling down at her. "They can tell whatever story they want. We'll write our own." She gave me a look then, steady, unguarded, filled with something that felt like peace. For the first time, I realized she wasn't just letting me in. She was choosing me, the same way I was choosing her. Back at her house, we unloaded the groceries, laughing as she teased me for bruising a peach. It was ordinary, almost mundane, and yet it felt extraordinary, because it was ours. When evening came, we sat again in her backyard, beneath the same stars that had witnessed her first confession. This time, there was no heaviness in her voice, no shadow of doubt. Just her hand resting over mine on the bench, her fingers tracing gentle circles as though she was memorizing the moment. The whispers still existed, beyond the fence, beyond the glow of her porch light. But here, in this space we'd claimed together, they were nothing more than echoes. As she leaned her cheek against my shoulder, her arm slipping naturally around mine, I felt a quiet certainty settle into me. Not the rush of infatuation, not the thrill of secrecy, but the steady warmth of belonging. And I knew, without needing to say it aloud, this was no longer about what people imagined. This was about us. And that was more than enough.